We have two different techniques in watercolor. One is wet in wet. Wet in wet is when my paper is wet and my brush is loaded with paint and water. So what happens is I wet the paper and I load my brush with color and water. You see, it bleeds, it spreads, and you have very soft edges. It is good when you want to have soft edges and not hard edges. This is called wet in wet. First one is brush, second one is paper. So my paper was wet here. And the next technique is called wet on dry. This is brush, this is paper. So my paper is dry, no water. My brush is loaded with paint and water. This technique is used when we want hard edges and details. We want to show the details. It doesn't bleed, it doesn't spread, it stays where it is. Okay, you can have details with this one. Some lines, whatever you want. But with in wet technique, when you put the color, it spreads and it creates soft edges for you. And each of these techniques have different applications. When you want to paint a landscape, for landscape painting, we use wet in wet technique. Okay, let's say I huff the paper and here I do wet in wet landscape, and here I do wet on dry landscape. And as I said, first one is brush, second one is paper. Okay, here I keep the paper dry, here I wet the paper. Let's see what happens. I'm wetting the paper. Okay, now I want to do a landscape, maybe starting from a sky. Okay, I get the blue color. Look at these beautiful clouds. With wet in wet technique, we can have very beautiful clouds. But if my paper is dry, and the technique called is wet on dry, what happens is the blue color doesn't spread, it stays where it is, and it doesn't create those soft edges for me. And eventually, I can't get these beautiful clouds. These misty clouds just can be created with wet in wet technique, not with wet on dry paper. Okay, now let's wet the paper again and let's do a tree. With wet in wet technique, I can have very beautiful trees. But if I do it on dry paper, see what happens. Not bad actually, but which one is better? I assume this one is better. So each technique has a different application. I can add more color to wet in wet technique. And then the trunk of the trees here. But here, trunk will spread because my paper was wet. So we understand sometimes we need wet in wet technique, sometimes we need wet on dry paper. For detail, we need dry paper. But when you want to create something misty with soft edges, we need wet paper. Imagine if I want to draw a bird. You see, on dry paper, I can easily have a beautiful bird. But if my paper is wet, what happens? I can't get a bird. Now I think you understand the difference between wet in wet technique and wet on dry paper. Okay, now I want to do, for example, land here. Here paper is dry and here paper is wet with water. Okay, if I load my brush, misty look, but here this is called dry brush technique. You see these white patches? You can get this with dry brush. Okay, if I want to add detail to wet paper, I need to dry it. Okay, now my paper is dry and I can easily draw a bird. I can draw the trunk for my tree. I can add branches. But if my paper was wet, I couldn't get this done. So it means when you do watercolor painting, sometimes your paper must be dry, sometimes your paper must be wet. And now I want to do a dry brush technique to get these white patches. I also can add more details to my tree. I put some dots. Some shadows, details. And then I wash my brush and with clean water, I soften some of the edges to create some dimensions and depths. I think now you know the difference between wet on dry paper, wet on dry paper, and wet in wet paper. Okay, now I want to do an apple with two techniques. First, wet on dry, and second, wet in wet. As I said, first one is brush, second one is paper. Brush, paper. Here paper is dry, and here paper is wet. Okay, wet in wet technique. I wet the paper like an apple shape. This is a white. This is a wet apple. Just wet the paper with clear water, and then we add some color. You see it spreads. It bleeds, and it creates soft edges for you. I can keep some highlights as well. And then I go darker to create some shadows here under the apple. Maybe going darker. This is wet in wet technique. Okay, and now let's do wet on dry paper apple, wet on dry. When we say wet on dry, my paper is completely dry, and I just start to paint an apple. Because my paper is dry, it doesn't spread, and its color is solid. It stays on the paper where you put the color, and I leave some highlights, and I go darker to the bottom part. I think now you understood the difference between wet in wet technique and wet on dry paper. And here I have a leaf and a leaf here, and also the stem for my apple. I don't know which one do you prefer, but I just wanted to explain the difference between the wet in wet technique and wet on dry technique. So if I want to create some beautiful clouds in the sky, I use wet in wet technique. See, these are beautiful clouds I can get with wet in wet technique. But with wet on dry, I can't get beautiful clouds. This is wet on dry paper, and this is wet in wet paper. Because my paper is wet, I have these misty shapes, soft edges, and beautiful clouds. If you want to learn watercolor, subscribe to my channel, and I have so many videos for doing flowers, and the videos are from scratch to the end, and you can watch them few times and you will learn watercolor technique. Watercolor is very relaxing, and this medium is amazing because sometimes there are so many accidents happen in watercolor that doesn't happen in other mediums. So that's the reason I love watercolor. It's very enjoyable and magical. If you enjoyed the video, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much. I see you in the next live